Today I'm going to talk about low heart rate training after 250 miles. 13.00 miles, 9 minutes, 10 seconds per mile, 141 beats per minute on average for the run. Absolutely enjoying my time out there for my Sunday run. Beautiful weather, and we're finally getting temperatures that are much more normal for this time of year. Still a little bit cold compared to the average, but much better than the weather than we've been having. With today's miles, I got to over 250 miles using low heart rate training solely as a training technique or Maffetone style running, where all of my runs have been at a specific low heart rate range. For me, I'm 40 years old, so I'm put my heart rate range at, or my training range at 135 to 145 beats per minute. Now, it was definitely a rough start. In the beginning, I was doing a lot of walking as my heart rate kept seeming to spike and jump right over the desired range, and it was extremely frustrating. The paces were also extremely slow, which is part of why the heart rate kept racing, because I was wanting to run faster, and I just don't like running that slow all the time. And I've definitely been complaining about it a lot, and I apologize for that, and I thank you guys for humoring me as I'm going through this kind of transitional time. Some of the things that I've been doing lately, I have been using a chest strap, and I have been using conductive gel because it's winter time now, or it feels like winter in Chicago, even though it's only mid-November. One of the things that I realized a couple weeks in, now I'm 4 weeks into this, is that the only times that I didn't really mind when I was running that slow is on days where I was hitting the gym and lifting weights for my legs. Now that's something that I've introduced to this marathon training plan. It's the first time I'm lifting weights during marathon training, and I would lift weights in the morning on Tuesdays, and in the afternoons I'd run home. That afternoon, and sometimes even that following morning, I really wouldn't care, and I would kind of like the fact that I was supposed to run slow. And so I've taken that concept and ratcheted it up, and this week I ran doubles. I did my kind of gym run double on Tuesday. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I also ran doubles. And somehow I ended up with 81.5 miles for the week. It's my highest mileage week ever. So that was pretty cool to see that. And definitely I'm enjoying running a little bit slower because my legs are taking a little bit more of a beating, but in a different kind of way than what I'm used to. So still not really loving running slower. Still really getting annoyed by getting passed by everybody out on the lake when I'm running out there, but my legs are now tired enough that they're not begging for slower paces, but they don't mind as much the slower paces. But a couple of interesting things have happened over the past couple of days. I also noticed this happening on my longer runs. Maybe it's because I'm getting better sleep. I'm not sure what it is. Even at the 100-mile mark of this style of training, is that a lot of the times the miles that I'm running are very slow for me, 10 minutes per mile or more, sometimes 10 minutes, 30 seconds per mile. And there are some times where I can, at the same heart rate range, run really fast. And it's not just always that, it's not like on a downhill, but it's usually on longer runs where I can get a stretch of relatively quick miles in, miles that are under 9 minutes a mile, so over a minute difference in pace. And so that's been encouraging. It's not happening every time. It's happening probably a rare minority of the time, but it's still happening with some level of frequency enough that it's encouraging. Now, before kind of the last 3 days weekends, Friday afternoon, Saturday, and Sunday run, I was getting very, very discouraged with this because I felt like, yes, I was overloading my legs with lots of extra mileage, so I should have taken that into account. And yes, I'm run commuting, so I'm running with a pack on, some extra weight. But it felt like the paces were going in the wrong direction. I felt like after 4 weeks, after over 250 miles, I should be feeling more adaptation to this style of training. So I was getting very nervous. I was getting concerned about junk miles. I was getting very concerned about, will I still be able to run fast when I need to run fast? Those thoughts were very prominent in my mind. But a couple of things happened this weekend. Friday afternoon, I got caught up late at work, and on my run commute home, I had to ditch Maffetone training for about a little bit less than a mile, as I realized I was going to be very late if I didn't do something right away to get home, back to school to pick up my kids. And so throwing all that other kind of heart rate range zones to the wind, I was able to run faster. It wasn't an outright sprint, but I was like, well, I'm gonna have to move a little bit, and this will be a nice test, kind of like an extended series of strides. And I think my paces were still in the mid 8s, maybe the low 8s for that time, but it felt great to run like that. And after a work week of doubles, and at the end of my run, it felt just beautiful to open up my stride a little bit and just go. It was just really, really nice. I really loved it. Then Saturday, the following morning, I went on my long run, about 2.5 hours. I had a stretch like today, where on the way back from my out and back on my run, I had a long string of miles that were under 9 minutes a mile, or right at the 9 minute per mile mark, all consecutively, which I thought was also pretty notable as well. And so that was very encouraging too. And so that combined with what happened today on Sunday, the day, the max in terms of my mileage for the week, I'm at the highest point of my week. The last miles of my run were also the fastest. So, and that's still staying at that 135 to 145 beats per minute heart rate range. So again, more promising things that are going on. So ultimately at this point, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a little bit of an audible on the plan, at least in terms of my Houston Marathon training plan. So if I didn't have a marathon coming up, I would probably just continue along this line, running a bunch of miles every week, low heart rate range, not worrying about speed at all, and just continue running like this for a couple more months. I think that's would have been ideal. I do have another marathon coming up in January, and so I think what I'm going to do is switch it up to more of a polarized approach for now, or at least starting to introduce more of a polarized approach. Switch to 90% of my mileage at this lower heart rate range, and 10% of the mileage being at something a little bit faster. So if next week on the plan I have 70 miles, I'll run 63 of them at lower heart rate range, and I'll introduce 7 relatively faster miles. And by relatively faster, I'm not sure what I'm going to do exactly with those 7. I think maybe on Thursday I'll have like a 2-mile set inside my longer, at some point of my running that day, a 2-mile stretch where I just run a little bit faster. I don't know if I'm going to go for pace or shoot for like a heart rate like 160 or maybe 165. But I'll do that on Thursday, and then on my Saturday run, I'll put in another 5 miles and sprinkle it, maybe a 2-mile, like 1 2-mile set rep, 1 2-mile rep, and another mile rep at higher heart rate, just to be able to put that in there so I get a little bit of that 90-10. It's going to be slow the first time, kind of reintroducing this, so I'm thinking probably like anywhere between 8:30 and 8 minutes per mile, whether I peg it to heart rate or I peg it to pace. Either one, I'm not exactly sure yet, but I think I'm going to start introducing that. Originally on my plan for the Houston Marathon training plan that I put together, I was pushing off starting to introduce some of these half marathon or marathon type efforts within longer runs a couple weeks later, in another 2 weeks, like basically December. But I think what I'll do now is I'll build up to that a little bit using more of a 90-10 approach and see where that goes, because I am starting to get worried. I've been looking at the Elevate add-in for Strava, and then I've looking at Metathon, and everything's kind of like plateauing or staying the same or getting worse. So I think I'm gonna stop looking at marathon for a little bit, because that marathon takes your last 8 weeks, rolling last 8 weeks. That for me has 3 weeks of taper, the Chicago Marathon, and then a week of marathon recovery in there as well. And so there's, for a while, it's gonna have some skewed data and data that's not necessarily pertinent to my low heart rate training that I'm trying for this marathon training block. So I'm going to stop looking at marathon for a little bit because it's just depressing. Every day, its projection for my marathon time gets lower and lower and lower. So I don't like it. It doesn't make me feel great. And then the Elevate app, I think a lot of you have been telling me about what I can expect in terms of what those graphs are going to look like. And I think until I start getting more of that polarized type training inserted into my training plan, that's not really going to be all that useful for me as well. So I'll still probably keep looking at both of those every day, but I'm going to try to take those with an even finer grain of salt as I move forward. So that's kind of my update now for the low heart rate training that I've been going with, calling a little bit of an audible, changing the Houston Marathon training plan just a little bit. I do wish I had more time to devote to pure low heart rate training, but there's marathons to be run and other things to think about. And the thing that I was thinking about long before the Houston Marathon training plan was that, you know, this style of training is something that I think I can kind of pick up and come back to as I need to, like in between races and when I'm not actively in marathon training blocks. Definitely something that I can kind of revert back to as a default mode. So those weeks where I don't have a necessarily set schedule of runs, only doing low heart rate training, I think is something that is going to be useful. Now, there's something that some of you who have been kind of cautioning me or saying that this plan or Maffetone doesn't make sense have been saying is that the running at this 135 to 145 beats per minute heart rate range just doesn't make sense, because if you look at elites, and I always have a little bit of skepticism when I'm comparing something that I want to do and extrapolating out something to elites. But if you look at elites, or if you look at sub-elites, if you look at people that are running highly efficiently, for them, if they were running most of their runs, 90% of their runs at like a 135 to 145 heart rate range, or if they're younger than me, a 140 to 150 heart rate range, they'd be running like 6-minute miles for 90% of their miles, and that just doesn't make sense, and it's inconsistent with what elites actually do. I completely agree. If I ever get to the point where I could run a 6-minute mile at 145 beats per minute, I'd be absolutely thrilled, but I also probably wouldn't do 90% of my runs at that heart rate either. I'd probably run them much, much lower. And I think that kind of the way that works is, right now I'm using the Maffetone heart rate range as my speed limit because I just want to run faster. I don't know, as someone at my place in this training, like kind of progression, being at the beginning of it, if I ran much slower at a much lower heart rate range, if it would provide as much benefit. I'm not sure about that. I'm still learning a lot about this type of training. But two things that have kind of come to light in my mind in terms of where this goes in the very long term, if I stay with this, if it works for me, is that yes, if I become very, very good at this, my Maffetone heart rate range might be too hard of an effort for my joints or for my body to handle. And I look forward to that, because I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks because I have a lot more time to run. All my runs take a lot longer. And the number 110 is a number of heart rate beat per minute that has jumped out at me on two very strange occasions. One, I was reading or listening to David Goggins' book. And he was going, in his book, he talks a little bit about like what specific training regimens he went through when he was, he also went through like the military training that he went through, but also when he was training for triathlons and things like that. And he almost never mentioned heart rate, except for when he was in the middle of his most intense triathlon training. He would say that even when he was running tons of miles, cycling tons, swimming tons, the one time he mentioned heart rate was that on Sundays, he would get on the bike and ride for a long time at 110 beats per minute. Then the next book that I'm just about finished with now is Meb Keflezighi's book. And he goes through a lot of his training. He goes through a lot of numbers. The only one time that I can recall so far that he mentioned heart rate was the time he got attacked by a dog in Greece. And he was saying that he was just going out for a shakeout run, going really relaxed. And he had noted in the book that his heart rate was 110 beats per minute on his shakeout run before he got attacked by a dog, and then his heart rate spiked. So that number, to me, I think that there's a certain point once you get very good at endurance training and your aerobic system is very finely tuned, that you leave that Maffetone heart rate range, which for Meb Keflezighi at that time would have been like 150 or 160 heart rate beats per minute. You go to something much, much lower that corresponds with a very, very easy pace. And I hope to one day get to a point where 135 to 145, or I guess when I get older and it'll be 133 to 143, or maybe 130 to 140, becomes like a moderate effort. And then my easy runs are running even lower than that. I'd love that. It's hard for me to see that future happening. So that's kind of the way that I'm approaching this from a long-term perspective, is that this Maffetone range, this narrow range that I'm currently in, is not going to be the only range that I ever run in. I don't think that's what Maffetone specifically sets out for racing anyway. Again, still learning, but at least in terms of my early phases of this type of running, figuring this kind of stuff out, that's really the only thing that I'm worried about. I'm not worried about VO2 max. I'm not worried about maximum heart rate. I'm not worried about any of the other stuff. Because frankly, when I start thinking about all that stuff, it just gets overwhelming and I get a little bit confused. So 135 to 145, I understand that for now. The wrinkle that I'm adding in now is a little bit of faster paced miles, slowly reintroducing that because I have been running so many miles at such a slow pace. And then hopefully we'll be able to get to a more purely polarized form of training where I'm running easy runs very, very easy and hard runs very, 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 or hard miles very, very, very hard. So we'll see how that goes. If you have any questions or comments about low heart rate training, I'll try to answer them the best I can, but there's a lot of you who know a lot about this, a lot more than me. You've been very helpful to me. I'm sure they'll chime in and help whenever they can as well, for those of you who have questions or are curious about this style of training. Before I go for today, I want to remind you guys about the charity runner for this week. This week, it's Gavin May, who's going to be participating in the Memphis Marathon weekend and raising money for St. Jude. I was happy to donate $70 to Gavin's fundraising efforts, and I'll post a link in the description in case you'd like to learn more. That's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of the video, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Yo, what's going on?